Alright, this is part 2 of our compositing tutorial, and for this tutorial, this one will cover basically how to get Blender to do the compositing for you. For this tutorial, I'm going to start basically in the same place that I started last time. And that is, I've just opened this file fresh. I don't have any of the compositing nodes or render layers that I created in the last tutorial. We're going to start fresh because this approach deals with those a little bit differently, and I don't want you to get confused by looking at what was there from the previous tutorial if you're just wanting to follow this tutorial. So here we are with our scene of two globes. You can see if we look at a rendered viewport that once again we've got our ground plane, we have our glassy globe, we have our wiry globe, and between those two we should be able to get kind of a fun idea of how this compositor treats the passage of light through these objects. So we need an object, we need a ground plane, we need a background image. So let's get started. We've got objects, we've got ground planes, we've got but we don't have a background image yet. So if I tap 0 on the number pad, we're now looking through our camera object. Tap N to open up our little side strip here, and let's put a checkbox under background images and add an image. Click open. We're going to go into my DES 3600 folder and double click on this DSC 0166, which we know was taken with a Nikon D3100 camera at 46 millimeters of zoom. So we've added that. If we tap Z to go into a wireframe view, we can see it as the background for our camera. We don't want it in any other views really, so I'll change this axis from all views to just camera, and it shows up there, and that'll give us an idea of kind of how things are going to render. Okay, so we kind of need to set things up in a way that's going to make sense for our background here. Since Blender's actually going to be doing the compositing for us, we kind of need to model some of this information that we can see here, like this cubic pedestal that things are going to be set upon. So first things first, let's kind of get our camera set up. I'm going to select the camera, come over here to camera, and of course it's already set to a Nikon D3100. Focal length, if you have a different kind of camera, you can change it here, or if it's not in that list, you can just Google the sensor size. The horizontal sensor size in millimeters is something you need to put in here. So that actually, it says Nikon D3100 here, but this is not the sensor size of a D3100. That should be 21.3. So let's go in and select that again. Okay, and now that's changed. Change our focal length to 46 millimeters, which is where it was at. And for this tutorial, I think we actually need to shrink these globes down to a realistic size. So if we look at these are each 2 Blender units tall, and a Blender unit is roughly correspondent to a meter. So these globes are almost 6 feet tall, or well, actually a little over, right? So they're pretty big, and we need them smaller. So I'm just going to drag a box selection here. I don't actually need the light or the camera, or for that matter the ground plane selected. So let's maybe we can get a better view here. I'll just select these objects individually. There we go. Okay, so that's what I need selected, and that's what I need to scale down. So let's I'm going to say we probably want these less than a foot tall. So that would be less than 1/3 of a Blender unit. Let's scale them to about that size and see kind of what they look like there. Okay, we're pretty far away, so they're looking way too small on our pedestal there. Let's now select our camera and get it a lot closer to our objects. Oh, are we above them or below them? Let's have a look. We're too high up. So move that in Z. Okay. So from here we can kind of start adjusting things a little bit better. What we need is we need to establish something that we can line up with the perspective on this, on the top of this pedestal. So I'm going to shrink my ground plane way down, and you might remember from class I actually don't have access to that pedestal to measure it. If I did, it would be good to measure it and put in the exact dimensions, but I think it's about 1.5 feet, about 18 inches. And it seems like, well, let's just see here. How many meters is 18 inches? So Google should give us a pretty quick answer here, 0.4572. All right. So I need to change not the scale but the size, the dimensions of this to 0.4572. 0.4572 Blender units. And let's kind of move things around. Let's get that lined up so that that lines up with the top of this box, because I think they should be close. So select my camera and hit Shift F to kind of start moving around with the WASD keys. And this moves a little bit rapidly at this scale. So at this point I'm just kind of barely tapping to sort of get things in place, and we're getting closer. Okay, so I'm going to click to release my controls there, and from here I'm just going to move with the G key, grabbing the Z axis. I think that needs to be flattened out a little. Shift F to, Shift F to look up, and that's getting closer. Now this camera was probably handheld when the shot was taken, so it may also not have been level, which might account for why things are looking a little funny from side to side here. So I might actually need to rotate my camera just a little to get that to line up. Now you're probably not going to get a real factory precision feel through an exercise like this, but it does take a while to get things lined up properly. In the end, however, I know when a lens, a still photography lens, says it's zoomed to so many millimeters, there's actually no real guarantee that it's exactly there. As a matter of fact, it's probably not. So at 46 millimeters, Blender is very mathematically exactly showing us a 46 millimeter field of view. The lens may not have been. So I might need to tweak things a little bit here. I'm going to select this plane, tab into edit mode, and I'm going to cheat a little bit. I'm going to manipulate these vertices in the X and Y coordinates, not in Z. I want this to stay flat. And I'm going to distort this just a little to get it to take up the right amount of space here. There we go. Okay, so select all that, extrude it downward, and that's pretty close to lining up, but we need to line up these other corners as well. Grabbing X, grabbing Y, and I am not going to move them in the Z axis. I want this all to stay flat. Grabbing X, grabbing Y, grabbing X. There we go. Grabbing X, grabbing Y, grabbing X, grabbing Y, grabbing X. Okay, that's getting close. All right. So I'm going to call that good for now. And I'm also going to put another ground plane below this. So tap 7 on my keyboard, create a plane, go back to my camera view, and I can't see the plane anywhere because it turns out it's above my little box here. Grabbing the Z-axis, we'll put this directly underneath that previous cube, so you can see why I still wanted the bottom of this to be completely flat. Grabbing Z, grabbing Z, grabbing Z. Okay, so that's pretty good there. And if I zoom in here, I can see that this cube looks like it was right on the edge of this other cube. So we'll move this again in the same axes. Grab an X, grab an Y, and try to kind of line that up. Okay, and that looks pretty good. So one of the reasons, I actually kind of technically don't need this second ground plane, but one of the reasons I put it there is I want to line up my sun, and I have this shadow for reference here. I want to line up the light so that it's shining exactly the way that it should be, and that shadow is a pretty good indicator of how it should be shining. So if I change this viewport to a rendered viewport, you can see that my shadow's going the entirely wrong way, and I can no longer see the background back here. So I need to go to my render settings, down under film, and check that transparent box, and now I can see the background. Further, I can't see the shadows that I'm trying to match up. Okay, so in order to be able to see the shadows in this rendered viewport, to start matching the light, what I need to do is come over here and change my background image from back to front so that it's actually rendering in front of my it's actually showing up in front of my rendered viewport here, so I can see my rendered shadow and I can see my photo shadow, and that helps a lot to figure out kind of where things should be. So I'm going to select the lamp here, and I'm going to turn this into a sun lamp, which will be way too bright at 600 since it doesn't decay at all. I'll turn that down to maybe 4. And I can also see that it's casting a really soft shadow now, whereas these shadows are pretty hard. That's because the sun is obviously visible through this window. It'll make a very small kind of pinpoint light source. And so what I need to do is I need to change the size of that to like 0.01 or something like that. And that's probably a little better light source. It's still facing the wrong way though, so I'm going to split out my view here and give myself a different view of the light so that I can kind of play with it. Let's bring it around. And again, with a sun lamp, it doesn't matter where it is, it just matters where it's facing. It's kind of this universal light source that just, it's directional, but doesn't have a position. And it doesn't need one because it doesn't decay. So I can see now that that's facing, let's give ourselves a little more room. That's facing roughly the right direction, but it's obviously facing down too much. So rather than, let's look at this from kind of a side view. Let's point that up, lengthen that shadow a little bit so that it looks like the sun's a little lower in the sky. Go back to our top view, and we've realigned it now a little bit, so twist it around, and that's getting pretty close. Whoop. Okay, right there. That's pretty close. I'm just going to tweak it a little bit more. Okay, and now we're casting just about the right shadow. Okay, so I'm happy with that. I'm going to close out this second window here, and my rendered shadow is now matching my photographic shadow very, very closely. Okay, so the next thing I need to do is get back to a shaded viewport, and let's select our globe objects here and put them down on top of this pedestal. So we want them actually really kind of sitting there just perfectly. And I think I probably want a little different view of them. So if I move them in this viewport, I want to tap G and then Shift Z so that I'm not moving them in the Z axis. I don't want them to start penetrating through the pedestal there. Okay, and that looks pretty good. Let's look at that in a rendered viewport. Okay, and I think I like the shadows that that is casting. Okay, the reason this looks transparent, of course, is that the image, my background image, is overlaid on top of it at 50% opacity. So that's kind of what's going on there. All right, so from here, now that we've got our scene set up roughly the way we want it, it's time to start compositing. So we have our object, we have our ground objects and our non-ground objects. So we need to kind of divide those. So one thing that really helps with this particular approach, in the last approach we didn't assign a material to our ground plane or our objects, but in this one it's going to be reflecting some light back up onto our object, and it's going to be influencing the color of our shadows. So we actually need to assign a material here. So let's select this box, and we'll actually rename it. We'll call this Pedestal 1. I'm a firm believer, I don't always remember, but I'm a firm believer in naming your objects so that you can keep track of them. Let's go to the material and make a new one here. We'll call this Pedestal. And I didn't see an awful lot of reflectivity there. Maybe there's a little, we might play with that at the end, but for the most part I'm just going to give this a diffuse color. I'm going to put my photo's opacity here at 100%, and I'm going to come and select a color with the eyedropper tool, and I'm going to select it from this photograph. So if I look over here, let's see, this ought to be a pretty good place to get my color from. It's not really deeply in shadow, but it's not overwhelmed by highlights either. So I'm going to say that color right there, and it's a little bit kind of on the green side of gray. And that's the color that I want my pedestals to be. So I can probably turn this background image off now. Let's look at our viewport and kind of see, yeah, okay, that's a little better. So I will now select the ground plane and assign the same material to that. Okay, so there's my materials. That should sort of help with reflected light. I have my sun lined up. It's time to start compositing. So I need to select my ground plane, and I need to select all of my light sources, which in this case there's just the one. So I have my ground objects and my light. I've selected all of those at once, and I'm going to move them to layer 2. However, unlike in the last tutorial, I'm going to hold down Shift while I do it so that they actually stay on layer 1 as well. So hold Shift, you can see both of these are selected, both layer buttons. So those objects now are on layer 1 and layer 2. Okay, so now it's time to go over and play with the render layers. We have our first render layer, which we can give whatever name we want. Let's just call it Objects, and our second layer we'll call Ground. Okay, and when we have objects selected, we want to select the first two layers from the scene, just like we did with the previous compositing tutorial. And again, this setting is layer independent. Those are now selected for both of our render layers, and those settings are the same for each layer. If you have those two layers selected, it'll be for all of your render layers. Okay, so for my first render layer here, I also want to come down here to passes, and I want to enable an object index pass. And I'm going to tell this render layer to include, both of the scene layers. So this is my first render layer. It's including both scene layers, and also I actually don't really know what words I'm supposed to use to describe that, I guess, but under layer you check both layers as well. So under ground you're going to have it behave a little differently. Under ground you're going to check just the second layer, and you're going to exclude the first layer. And if for some reason you don't see this exclude option here, that means you haven't changed to the cycles renderer, FYI. So this one does not need the object index checked, but the first render layer does. So this is what the first render layer looks like, both checked in scene, both checked in layer, and under ground, the second render layer, both checked in scene, second checked under layer, first checked under exclude. Okay, so that's basically what we need to do with our render layers there. Now we need to come in to our scene again, and we need to select or assign pass indexes to these objects. So I'm going to select my globe here, come over to its object data, and put it on pass index 1. I'm also going to select all of the pieces of it and do the same thing to them. Pass index 1 for every piece of this globe, and also for the glass globe that's next to it. Everything on pass index 1. For the ground elements, pass index 2. Just for the ground elements. Okay, and that's all I need to do as far as pass indexes goes. So that's basically everything we need to do there. Let's split our window out. And I'm going to change my second window to a node editor. And just like in the other tutorial, we don't want to be playing with our materials, we want to be playing with our compositing. So we're going to click here to display the compositing node tree and put a checkbox next to use nodes. Okay, and once again we find ourselves in the same situation. We've just got one render layer with a node here, an output node going right into our composite node. So we need another render layer. We can add that under input, render layers, or we could just duplicate the other one. Both of these are currently set to be a node for an output node for the objects render layer. We need one of them to be the output node for the ground render layer. You can see that because we checked under our render layers, our objects layer has the object index pass checked. This node has an output for that, index OB. That's going to be important right there. Okay, I also need, since Blender is going to be doing our compositing for us here, I need one more type of kind of first layer node here, and that's going to be an input. It's going to be an image. So my image is going to be set here, and I want to select my background image. And that makes me think, actually, I may have done something dumb here. Let's look through. Sure enough, after all that work getting everything lined up, I did not change the resolution of my camera object. So let's turn our background image back on and see what kind of damage I've done here. Make it so we can see these objects. Accidentally hitting X instead of Z. Alright, so let's go to our resolution settings, and I need to, once again, 4608 by 3072 is where I need to be. 4608, 3072. Whoa, 3072. And you can see that I am not lined up as well as I thought I would, so allow me to tweak that just a little. There's not really much point in trying to get this to line up, since I actually did the little cheating tweaks when I had the wrong resolution selected. So let that be a lesson to you. I hope it's a lesson to me. I don't ever seem to learn it. I always forget that, so I hope you'll forgive me, but I am as human as the next guy when it comes to this stuff, that's for sure. And again, I'm only moving these in X and Y. I do not want to get that plane off of level. Okay, there we go. So that's looking a little better. And we also need to move the ground plane down. Look at this maybe from a better perspective. There we go. All right, so that should shade about right. Sorry about that. You know what? Let's just make sure our shadows are still lining up the way they should. That's pretty close. So for the sake of brevity in the tutorial, I'm going to stick with that. All right, so we have our image input node over here now. Whoop. And what we need to do now is basically, well, let's do a quick render here. I didn't really want it to render in that viewport. Let's see. All right, let's do a quick render here. Oh, and you know what? I'm also going to turn my samples down so that you don't have to sit through too much rendering. Okay, I'm going to do this quick render because I want the previews to show up in the render layers so that you can kind of have a little better visual reference as to what's going on here. Okay, so render layer 1 has rendered out now. It's rendering layer 2. It's currently, the composite node is just plugged into render layer 1, so that's what it's going to show us when it's done. Okay, so there's the rendering result from render layer 1. Perfect. Okay, this is what render layer 2 looks like. It's basically just everything we don't need from that setup. So what we can do is we can go to Add, Color, Mix, and change this color mix from its default mix setting to Divide. And we can divide the results of one render layer from another. And that will help us to kind of get started. So we need basically 3 of these color mix render nodes. So I'm just going to duplicate that twice. Put the composite clear out here because we're going to have to plug into it last. And the other thing we're going to need is we're going to need 2 ID mask nodes. So under converter ID mask, you can add both of those. Shift D. One of them, you remember how we set a pass index to our different objects. The background objects have a pass index of 2. Foreground objects have a pass index of 1. So we'll set one of these ID mask nodes to a pass index of 1 and one to a pass index of 2. Okay, so the index, basically we need to plug that index output into both of those. Alright, and from there our second color mix node needs to be changed to a multiply mix node. And what we're going to do is multiply the output of this render, or this, sorry, we're going to multiply actually our background image by the result of our division of these 2 render layers. And our factor for that multiplication is going to be the alpha channel generated by this ID mask. Okay, then our last color mix node actually, whoops, didn't mean to plug that in there. It actually needs to be a mix. So we are going to take the image output, well, that did plug in the right spot. So we're going to take the image output from our first render layer, and we're going to mix it with the result of this multiplication. Our factor for that mixing is going to be the alpha channel generated by this second ID mask. And so you can see now how that shows up. Now you might say, well, why is everything so small? Why isn't it lining up? The answer to that is that I'm compositing onto just this image. I'm bringing it straight into the compositor. It's not rendering at all. And it is 4,608 pixels wide by 3,072 pixels tall, whereas I'm only rendering to 50% of that size. So that's my render size. I need to increase that to 100% of the background image size if I want that to show up correctly. So now if I render this out, and again I'll speed this up for the video here. Okay, and after rendering layer 2, it then composites them together, and we get our result. And you can see here that we now have some of the reflected color and the caustics coming through this glass, and things are behaving a lot more properly as they come through. Okay, that's I forgot to select the wire the wire part of this globe and put it on index number 1, so that's why that's showing up really oddly. So, but that's a better rendering method as far as compositing, because you get your reflected light, you get your caustics and translucent, you get to see how your object actually affects the light. We could actually, there are ways, we could add this image back here as a reflected map or something for our glass here and actually have those things be reflecting properly as well. But for now, that's basically how you would composite those together. One other thing to pay attention to here, just like with the previous composite, if we were to zoom way in on this, you'd see that the edges are too sharp to be believable. We don't really have to go into Photoshop to accomplish our blur there or anything like that. We can actually rely on our camera simulation. So if I select the camera and I go into the camera data over here, then I can change, I can select an object for the camera to focus on, and I can change the aperture. That's one advantage of getting things roughly a realistic size here, is the aperture will behave the way that it should in terms of defocusing the results here. So if I were to look at a rendered viewport, for instance, and zoom in on that now, you'd see that the edges of this globe are a little bit fuzzier because I've opened the aperture up to f5.6. I can create more blurry on the edges by lowering that aperture number to say f4, and that might be a fairly realistic number for this. So that's one way to get your blur to look realistic and to get your composite to blend together even better. So I hope this helps. Thanks.